Abram, most of you will know as a prolific essayist, a public intellectual, and author of at least 2 masterworks which are well known internationally, In Care of the State, and the one that has been referred to quite a bit today, Words of the World. Much else besides, but today he's going to talk about the global coordination problem, collective action among unequal states. And it's worth reminding ourselves, particularly reminding someone like me, whose academic career has been a lifelong escape from mathematics, that Abram does mathematics, and that he first made a great mark on academic life with work that is still remembered by colleagues of mine in political science on, I suppose, mathematical coalition theory. So if you can solve the problem of the world's lack of coalitions, that would be very useful.
Okay. Thank you. Dear friends and colleagues, en dag Johan Heilbron, die vast volgt wat zich hier allemaal afspeelt en die hier nu niet kan zijn, van de belangrijkste organisatoren van deze, one of the most important organizers with Nico of this get-together, but who is struck by COVID. So, dag Johan Heilbron. I have not come to praise Johan Goudsblom, but to emulate him by following in his footsteps and taking one small step beyond where he left off. Here, I intend to present some reflections on contemporary predicaments that concern humanity in its entirety, problems of global coordination through collective action among unequal states. Both Job Goudsblom and his friend and mentor Norbert Elias were rather reluctant to comment on current affairs. They studied long-term, very long-term problems in a process perspective, and in the latest phase of his scholarly career, Johan Goudsblom was a pioneer in the study of what is called big history, nothing less than a process approach to the universe and humankind's place within it. But on the other hand, during the past pandemic, or in the ongoing debate about climate change, the voice of sociologists was rarely or maybe never heard, and certainly never heeded. The absence of sociology in public affairs. I am firmly convinced that sociologists can make a valuable contribution to the current public debates precisely on the strength of sociological theory. Such interventions come with the risk of being proven wrong when events take, as they are wont to do, a different and unexpected turn. But I'll take that risk. One recurrent theme in the work of Norbert Elias and Johan Goudsblom, and in their tracks in my own writing, is the extension of the scale of human interdependencies, admittedly with leaps and bounds, and with relapses over the long course of history. In Elias's oeuvre, the part that most directly addresses this theme is, of course, in the civilizing process, the section on the monopoly mechanism. And now we'll skip the section with my explanation because for this audience, I need not tell what's in there. By the way, exactly when he discusses medieval state formation, Elias expressly refers to the competitive struggles and the monopolization taking place under our very eyes. So he suddenly alludes to contemporary events. And in his general exposition, Elias mentions free competition among more or less equal feudal units, from which gradually more successful, larger units emerge. The end result in many cases will be the formation of a single dominating unit, and the remaining smaller entities will vie for the favor of this one preponderant entity in what he calls bounded or monopolistic competition. The final outcome of this process may well, but it need not be, the formation of an outright monopoly of the means of violence and taxation over an extensive territory, the nation-states. At present, practically the entire surface of the Earth is neatly carved up in almost 200 territories, each controlled more or less effectively by a distinct state, with remarkably stable borders. To speak of a world order would be a grandiose exaggeration, but qualifying this figuration as a chaos or an anarchy would equally underestimate its structural properties. Free competition in the sense of Elias, it certainly is not, and obviously a global monopolist has not emerged so far. These states are very unequal as to the expanse of their territories, and what matters more, as to the number of their citizens and the size of their gross national product. The largest few states are the giants among nations: China, the USA, India, and this emergent entity called the European Union. The countries of the world are a very unequal lot. Although most of them are quite competitive in many respects, there is not a free competition, since they are hemmed in by international law and international organizations, and by the power of these respective giants, which compel the smaller countries to compete for their favors and to play these giants off against each other if they have an opportunity. The present global order most closely resembles what Elias called bounded competition. Johan Goudsblom's Fire and Civilization can be read as an account and an explanation of what he has called the lengthening and the tightening of the chains of dependency over the course of human history, from these small roving bands of 100 or so hunter-gatherers to the giants of today with over 1 billion closely interdependent citizens. And I quote Goudsblom, "Despite the contrasts which divide it, humanity is becoming increasingly more integrated into one global society." And according to Goudsblom, it was the growing mastery of energy that both allowed and compelled human beings to form such increasingly complex, intensive, and extensive networks. And in the last pages of his book, Goudsblom evokes a global panorama of states, companies, and research institutions pressuring one another in mutual competition to develop new forms of energy so as to support ways of life that no one individually can afford to abandon, and that humanity in its entirety can no longer afford to sustain in the face of a disastrous warming of the Earth. So, in the contemporary world, some 200 states compete for scarce resources such as fuel and food, and for regional predominance. In this process, a few entities, the 4 giants, have achieved a position of near monopoly in their respective area, with adjacent states vying for their favors in a form of bounded competition. But this figuration of relatively autonomous states is faced with challenges of global dimensions, transcending the capacity of any single entity, even of the giants on their own, and in this worldwide figuration, the end game of global monopoly formation is as yet nowhere in sight, and it might not ever occur. Instead, a complex network of transnational organizations has emerged, still mainly based on the voluntary cooperation of member states, and at the center of this network are the United Nations with its Security Council and with a whole network of related international organizations. Moreover, a web of international treaties and regulations has added to this lengthening and tightening interdependencies. But there is no central agent to enforce these treaties, regulations and decisions of transnational organizations and international courts. In fact, the enforcement depends on the authority, between quotation marks, of these institutions, on public shaming, and in the very last instance, on the imposition through violent means by a coalition of the willing. Yesterday's very brief incident in which Joe Biden was asked by a reporter whether he thought Putin was a war criminal, which, by the way, is a legal term, it's not just a curse word, and he said no. And then he came back a minute later and he said, yes, he is a war criminal. That's what you call global shaming, because all of you have noticed it. The most coherent and most powerful military alliance in the world is probably NATO, led by the giant USA in close collaboration with the giant European Union. But even NATO lacks a mechanism to compel its members to adhere to its or America's decisions, if need be, with violent means. In other words, within states, the capacity for effective coordination has been established to a high degree, but among states, the capacity for effective coordination is much less effective and so far inadequate to impose and effectuate policies that might resolve the global challenges that humankind is faced with in the present world. The first and foremost of such challenges, it has been mentioned this afternoon, is the warming up of the Earth, the climate crisis. And Goudsblom, Fire and Civilization may be read as an account of the social genesis of this climate crisis in the very, very long term. In today's world, at the global level, the means of effective coordination of the states are still woefully inadequate to control this crisis. And in the meantime, in the past few years, humanity has been facing another crisis of global proportions, the COVID-19 pandemic, caused by the recently emerged SARS-CoV-2 virus. Initially, many states reacted as they always had before in the face of the threat of an epidemic, for example, Ebola, by acting on their own and closing their borders to all foreign travelers. This turned out to be, again, completely ineffective. Thus, the states as units of effective internal coordination proved to be inadequate when confronted with a global challenge. Luckily, within a few months, scientists in several countries succeeded in developing a highly effective vaccine. But this did not resolve one other global problem. Low-income countries lacked the economic and the political means to acquire sufficient quantities of this vaccine, and thus became, and even today still are in large part, literally breeding grounds for more contagious and more lethal varieties of the virus that remain prone to spread to high-income countries also, even now that they had succeeded in bringing the known varieties under control. What faces humankind at this point, once again, is a problem of collective action among highly unequal states, each one a unit of more or less adequate internal coordination, but in their totality incapable of effective coordination at the global level. In general, such problems of collective action arise among units that are interdependent, that are aware of their interdependency, but that do not together constitute a figuration that can effectively coordinate the actions of the constituent elements. In other words, collective action dilemmas are an intermediary phenomenon between interdependence and effective coordination. That is precisely the phase in which the contemporary global figuration of so-called sovereign but interdependent states exists. There is a third example of a most recent coordination problem which will demonstrate precisely this relapse of global coordination and a leap towards regional coordination, and antagonistic, even bellicose confrontation. I will come to that soon. The general theory among economic theorists was, and often still is, that under these conditions that I just spelled out, collective goods will not be created and the commons will be destroyed. Yet in the real world, interdependent actors without outside compulsion do succeed time and again in realizing collective goods. Again, I skip the elementary definitions of collective goods and collective action because most of you by now are well aware of them. But if only economic theorists knew more about social reality, and if only sociologists would not be so intimidated by economic theory, this conundrum would have been resolved long ago. As I have argued in my In Care of the State, and as Margaret Ostrom has demonstrated in her famous Governing the Commons, the evolution of institutions for collective action, which, by the way, gained her, deservedly so, the Nobel Prize in Economics. In the real world, collective action problems are not a static phenomenon. They occur as a process among real human beings, need I remind you of that? And in such a moving figuration, leaders operate by invoking moral values, loyalties, by raising expectations, accentuating or falsifying the chances of success, or lowering or falsifying the estimates of the cost of collective action. And if the leader is successful in convincing the participants, these false expectations may become self-confirming and end up being true. Moreover, certain rules concerning the distribution of costs and rewards may be generally accepted as moral values among the participants who all believe that all others believe them to be valid. Thirdly, collective actions are not a one-shot game, but a process. And participants will monitor what others do or don't, contribute and adjust their own choices accordingly by mutual inspection. Finally, participants do police one another, and economists believe that mutual policing is itself a collective action problem which gives rise to the same dilemmas. But every normal human being, and even sociologists, know that this is not the case, because policing one another is not necessarily a cost. It may be a secret pleasure, like chiding somebody who is a laggard or a refuser, or gossiping about how lazy and dumb other participants are. This is a little sociological secret, which Norbert Elias was very good at describing in his essay on gossip. What I have just done is giving you the sociology of collective action, which was notably absent in the economic theory of collective action, and which of itself explains why we do have collective goods and do have collective action without outside compulsion. In the present world context, the giants perform the leading role in their part of the world. International law sets the rules that help to coordinate the actions of state actors. International organizations, the UN foremost among them, provide a forum for mutual inspection of the contributions by individual states and for public criticizing and shaming. One most germane and recent instance of an attempt at global collective action concerns the distribution of anti-COVID vaccines by high-income countries among low-income countries over the past year or so. By the way, exactly 1 year ago, together with the virologist Raul Coutinho, I wrote a little article urging the collective action to spread COVID vaccines. Raul Coutinho didn't believe that collective action would come about. I thought it would. Raul turned out to be right. But we were not alone. The Pope did so at the same time. 23 government leaders, among whom our own Mark Rutte did so, and many other international organizations urged the distribution of vaccines from rich countries to poor countries. And of course, indeed, the reason to do so, to prevent new strains of new, more lethal and more contagious strains of the virus emerging in low-income countries, exactly that happened with the Omicron virus, which emerged most likely in South Africa. But global collective action to eradicate contagious disease was by no means a novelty. Smallpox had been banished. There were huge campaigns to fight tuberculosis, malaria, HIV. A network of international organizations existed to coordinate the collection and distribution of vaccines. And indeed, hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of doses were delivered, in fact, but a coordinated, massive global campaign never came about, even though the costs were a trifle compared to the enormous expenses of national governments in order to keep their internal economies going. I won't go into what happened, but let me sum it up in one word. People started to believe that COVID, after all, wasn't all that dangerous. Yes. And the motivation to help third world countries out of an enlightened self-interest sort of diminished quickly. This is important because the fear motive may be the overriding motive to engage in collective action. The fear motive is also at the core of the global climate campaign to prevent the earthly atmosphere from further warming up. This is Goudsblom's main theme in the last chapters of Fire and Civilization. Especially in the wealthier Western countries, citizens, and especially the young, are constantly reminded of the catastrophe that will soon visit humankind if the consumption of fossil fuels and of plastics made from them is not immediately curtailed. I won't scheme. It is indeed a massive intimidation campaign, and probably with good reason. Moreover, it seems to work, slowly but surely. But one major problem is the definition of a universally accepted rule for the division of burdens. Poorer nations argue, convincingly so, that they have not contributed to global heating in the past, and even now do so much less than wealthier nations. Countries that industrialized at a relatively late stage, like the giants China and India, make a similar argument about their still recent pre-industrial past. Nations that began to industrialize on a grand scale already in the 19th century should, they argue, therefore shoulder the largest burden. And in fact they do, headed by the Western giants USA and the EU. A continual succession of climate conferences provides the opportunity for mutual inspection of each country's polluting activities and efforts to fight climate change. So there is no one instance of truly global collective action with momentous stakes getting off the ground. But, it is getting off the ground ever so slowly and nevertheless picking up momentum as a global campaign against climate change. But fear is the overriding motivation, intimidation, the paramount driving mechanism. But sometimes, albeit very rarely, a collective campaign erupts in a matter of weeks, even days. In this particular instance, fear, with its twin anger, is once again the leading incentive. Exactly 3 weeks ago today, Russia invaded Ukraine, and it was only a matter of days before a grand Western coalition came to the aid of Ukraine with advanced weapons and all sorts of relief supplies. A large number of countries volunteered to contribute. They agreed to impose sanctions upon Russia that were quite likely to cut into their own flesh. And even more amazing, those countries suddenly were willing to take in huge numbers of Ukrainian refugees, something they had resisted staunchly until now in most other instances. The leading two countries were the two giants, USA and the European Union, and the members of the European Union also acting in an individual capacity. There also happened to be a very clear-cut template for their coordination, which was the NATO treaty, which had lain mostly dormant for about 30 years, but was still known to every participant and could work as a rule of the distribution of burdens. And it turned out to be highly effective, as Hungary was taught within 48 hours, which had not exactly understood its obligations under NATO, but it quickly learned. I won't go into any more detail because of limits of time, but what the point I wanted to make, I hope I have demonstrated. Sociologists do have some theoretical instruments at their disposal to study the dynamics of competition and domination at the global level, taking their cues from Elias's theory of state formation among competing entities, and they can base their understanding of the global climate crisis, the major collective action challenges in the major collective action challenge in the contemporary world through a reading of Goudsblom's insights in the almost unavoidable external effects created by competing human economies, compelling one another to increase their fuel consumption and thus heating up the terrestrial climate. Finally, sociological insights into the actual process of participants engaging in collective action and producing collective goods help to understand the ongoing coordination problems between unequal states. By tradition, this is the remit of international relations. But even international relations are, in last analysis, relations among human beings, and therefore can be productively studied with conceptual tools taken from sociology. I think sociology has remained absent long enough from current affairs. It is time to enter the public debate again. Thank you.
Okay. Did you ever consider the workings of a living cell? Because it's very interesting. It's exceedingly complex, and there is no direction. There's no monopoly. It just acts by itself, and all these things work up against each other. Whereas we are always think we need all kinds of directors and boards and things like that. I think it's stupid in the end, and on the long run, we may find out that we could just organize ourselves in different ways. Would that be?
I'm completely ignorant, so I listen.
Oh well, you know how a living. I'm about. I've been.
One little response. Yes, individual cells function.
Or even biological systems, even your body does, and my body.
No cell operates in isolation.
Exactly. And there is no efficiency in it. But it's very sloppy. The organization of the cell. There are many mistakes and things, and all kinds of chaos is in it. But the nice thing is it's effective. Mm-hmm. And rather, to be efficient is dying and is death, because conditions change a little bit, and you are not efficient anymore. And for the rest, it's very expensive, energy-wise, to be efficient. So it just goes by itself, you know. It's like self-organizing system.
Yeah, okay.
And would that be something for us? I mean, for this kind of...
I would have to ponder that and get into cellular biology before I can answer that. But
I'll teach you. It's 5 minutes.
Please do. We have ample opportunity.
It's another day.
Don't forget to identify yourself, by the way. Oh, well, I think we know
I'm very much interested in your analysis of climate change, and I thought it conflicted somewhat with the analysis of Frans Cyrus. So I would like to compare that. I mean, if I understood Frans Cyrus well, he said, well, I mean, it's just advantage. I mean, it has only advantages to go over to the new sources of energy. So, if that's true, there is no problem of collective action. So,
you know,
I would say,
when I still walked in the pre-Cyrus phase of darkness.
Yeah, maybe.
But
I don't know. Well, I mean, why would China and India so reluctant to this transition?
I understand.
Yeah.
Well, I think I understand you. I think even in the collective action approach which I'm employing here, it is in everybody's interest to act in concert. And, for example, do away with fossil fuels. But in the short term, for individual participants, it may be very advantageous to keep on using fossil fuels. And I think Frans might agree with that. So we have a problem of what you call, it's also called prisoner's dilemma, that in short term, actors may act in limited self-interest and thereby inhibit that's precisely the problem. And here it may be, for example, to the advantage of many countries to keep on using fossil fuels, because the price will be lowered if all the others abandon it, even for that simple reason. That's called profiteering. Mm-hmm. Well, you're very familiar with that, of course. Not personally, but as a scientist.
I've been very liberal with the time, by the way. I couldn't bring myself to interrupt Bram.
That's a weakness.
But carry on. We can take another couple of questions.
Thank you for your insights. My name is Schulz-Meinen, Heimo Schulz-Meinen from Hanover. You were mentioning the remarkably permanent boundaries of the 200 states.
Yeah.
I missed the mention of one of the founding fathers of collective action, Manco Olsen, who has shown that democracies work pretty much in shifting elites. in their power. So would it be much less surprisingly that the boundaries remain stable if you had mentioned that the club of the 200 states work and function as a club to maintain property rights? Thank you.
Yes. Yes. I'm also thinking of Thomas Schelling's ideas about the boundaries. But if you think there must be about 1,000 international boundaries. Very few of them have changed in the past 50 years. But of course, once one changes, it's all hell breaks loose. Therefore, you think that they may be very brittle, but they aren't. Yeah.
One more? If not, we can move instantly to the real event of the evening, namely drinks. And I'd like to thank Bram for that. I think we've sorted out the future of the world, or at least over the course of the day's discussions, pointed why the future of the world is not so easily solved, but you're more optimistic than I am, Bram. You don't have to answer that.
I don't know how optimistic you are.
Let's adjourn.